Welcome everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tutor, back today with another complete scene build. And this time we're creating a stylized tranquil cherry tree scene environment. And if you're interested in how long this scene actually took to create and what we thought the difficulty level was, then stay till the end where we'll give you a detailed breakdown of every part of the build. This scene comes with its own blend file, not only so you can see how the scene was created, but also so you can actually use the tree and its leaves within your own Blender project. Everything is named and ready to go. There's an Unreal Engine 5 texture pack as well. So whether you want to use Blender or Unreal Engine, the choice is up to you. Links to the Gumroad are down below, and of course it's free to all of our Patreon members, along with over 250 hours of Blender courses. So be sure to check those out. And every Monday, right here on our YouTube channel, you'll find a tutorial covering some of the techniques in depth that you'll find in our complete scene builds. As always, if you want to get your ideas featured in one of our scenes, then drop your comments down below, and we've had some amazing ideas so far, and at least 2 of them are in the works. Finally, all the techniques you see here in these scene builds are covered in our massive library of over 20 courses and 200,000 downloads, so be sure to check those out. But enough of all that, what you're here for is to see how we put this scene together. So let's get started on our stylized tranquil cherry tree scene.
To start off the part for the gray boxing, I decided to use a Zbrush just because we have so many organic shapes for the environment, and right away I just wanted to set up my references on the side. It's always useful to use them, so that's what I did. And I wanted to start it off by just getting some bits and chunks for an island, and I figured that I might as well start it off to make the island look as if some of the pieces and chunks are like kind of floating around. In the end though, I decided to scrap that idea. I didn't quite like it as much, so I wanted to keep it as simplistic as possible. There was no need to add too much detail or complicated detail to the scene and have any of the unnecessary noise. So right now I'm building up the shape and the formation of an island. I'm figuring out how the tree is going to be formed and how it's going to look like in comparison to the overall composition of this kind of a scene. So right now I'm just building it up, just thinking of the way this entire tree would be leaning over and how its roots would be affecting the island and whatnot. And I'm figuring out how else I'm going to add the kind of a house, or rather the door for the island, and how it's just going to look overall. And I'm thinking of adding a kind of a swing just to liven up the scene, because we can also have that animated and it would just bring up the entire environment back to life. For the tree, I figured that the overall shape wouldn't look quite as nice. The bark itself would look quite plain and it wouldn't break off the edge. So in order to break off that edge, I figured that I might as well use like a sort of a fungus for the side of a bark, and have that kind of an edge just broken off just a little bit by that. And now I'm thinking how I can make use out of the roots that we already have, and how we can just kind of warp it around the entrance to the house, just to have the vegetation kind of a feeling and make it look as whoever lives there is just kind of in harmony with the entire nature of that island. So right now I'm also thinking what else I can add, and I really wanted to add sort of a kind of lanterns to the scene and just have it stay at the front, just to kind of catch the attention of an eye. I will have some nice kind of light flicker in the end, and I think it'll look really nice. But I'm thinking like, what should I do about the base? I don't want to kind of leave it as just plain sticking it to the dirt. So what I figured I'd do is I'd get some kind of stone slabs and just attach it to the bottom section of that lantern. And I think that will look really nice in order to break apart the bottom, and as well as I didn't want to make it look just completely kind of a square slab, so I wanted to have it more of a stony look, again just to work with that kind of a flow of organic aesthetic. So right now I'm also thinking, what if I'd add some organic shape into the swimming pool? What if I'd actually add something to show who lives in that kind of a place? And I'm thinking of a spirit tree or something, but in the end I figured that it might not look quite as well, mainly because I wanted to keep the mystery of that kind of environment. But at the very start, while working with the gray boxing, it's always important to just experiment with the kind of aesthetics and the type of feeling you want to get out of your environment. You just want to make as many quick changes as possible and don't let yourself get hindered by the entire kind of meshes or any of the models that you have. You just want to have as much freedom as you can get, just to again play around with the shapes and get the right kind of a feel for the overall aesthetic and the silhouette of the environment that you're creating. So right now I'm also thinking on what to do with the post. I'm also thinking about attaching some stones at the bottom. Maybe it would look better that way, maybe not. But just playing around with the overall shapes. Right now I'm using something called Z Modeler just to play around with the shapes. Although it would be probably easier to create that in something like Blender, I just wanted to get a little bit more something of a less organic type of a shape. And again, I'm not too worried about polygons or anything of the sort. I just want to get the overall kind of a design, the look out of the way, and just make it look a nice kind of a feel. So right now I'm still playing around with the island, still trying to figure out the overall shape and design it would have. And in the end, though, I figured it'd be much nicer to have the door right underneath the tree. I think that brings the eye it makes the overall aesthetic more eye-catchy and straight up draws the eye towards the underneath of that tree. So I think later on I will do that, and I'll have a pull in the area where I have the idea for where the door is now. But in the end, again, just by playing around with the shapes and not being too attached to overall design and getting the type of form you want to get is definitely a way to go with the gray boxing. So once I was happy with that, I went ahead and exported out as FBX and gave the entire thing over to Neil to continue the modeling process.
Hello and welcome everyone to the modelling part of the stylized treehouse scene. And most of this is actually going to be done in actual Zbrush. So you can see there that when I first brought Luke's grey box in, it actually didn't come in properly, because sometimes if you're exporting from Unreal Engine as an FBX, it ends up with a lot of problems actually when you try and bring it into Zbrush or Blender or something like that. So what I did was I first of all took it into Blender and then I exported out as an LVJ from there. Alright, so most of this is actually going to be done in Zbrush, and the reason is because it's just so easy just to get that kind of nice actual feel from that grey box and kind of plan it all out. So all you can see at the moment, all I'm using is just the clay tubes, clay, and just a simple clay brush just to actually build up the actual scene into what actually I want it to be. You can see here as well that I actually use a lot of the trim dynamic brush. I very rarely actually smooth things out. Try and get away from actually just simply smoothing something with the shift button when you're actually working in ZBrush, and more or less just use H-Polish, trim dynamic or something like that. It'll give you a much better look. You can see here I'm starting on the tree, and I figure that the best actual way to do this is basically just to move out the parts and then just Dynamesh. So it's just move, Dynamesh, move again and Dynamesh. I just found I had a lot of control. You could use the snake hook, which I actually go in and actually use a bit later on, but just to get the actual part of the tree just nailed down, looking the way I want it, I just decided to use move, pull it out, and then a little bit of inflate, just in case I lost too much geometry there. If you lose too much geometry, all you end up doing is putting holes in the mesh when you actually Dynamesh, so that's why you should use the move and the inflate at the same time. You can see here I'm just isolating that out with a mask and then just pulling the rest of the roots out. So basically what I'm trying to say is plan it out, get the roots in some kind of working order, and then you can come in and actually fix them as you go along. So now you can see I'm actually planning out the tree, how big do I want it to be, how thick do I want it to be, all sorts of things like that. You can see here now I've got my actual snake hook on, and this is really a good tool because basically as you move it along and pull it out, you can actually move it up and down and you get some really nice branches and things like that. We did decide to actually do this in ZBrush as a tree rather than doing it in something like Blender or something even like a speed tree, because we just found that we had a lot more control into how we actually want to put the tree right off the bat. In speed tree we could have done this and it would have looked good, but you end up like moving branches around and things like that, whereas here you're basically building it exactly as you want it. Alright, so you can see here I'm actually coming in. I gave a few brushes a try to get that kind of stylized bark look that I'm looking for, and I just went for the clay basically. And all I'm doing now is I'm just going around trying to follow the actual form of the actual tree. So you can see I'm following it round like on a curve or something like that. See, I made a little bit of an indentation there just to give it some character. Very, very light touches here. Obviously I'm using a graphics tablet as well. And when I came to the roots, I decided that these roots, they look a bit too rounded and things. So basically I'm inflating, using the clay, using the trim dynamic, and then I'm just cutting actually some of those away there with trim curve. Just to kind of make them more earthy and sharp in some places and things like that. Because when you use the move tool, you can see there those little holes that appeared. That's because when you're using the Dynamesh, basically if you've not got enough geometry there on the front and the back face, it will actually put holes in your mesh. So the way you deal with that is you just use the inflate tool, inflate it out and re-Dynamesh it, smooth it over, and then you should end up with a nice mesh again to redraw. And you can see I had the same problem there. And sometimes ZBrush, it will actually put holes all over the mesh. If that ever happens, just press Ctrl Z, inflate, and then just Dynamesh it again. It should be absolutely fine. You can see here already how quick it was. It's probably around 20-minute mark at this point to actually build this scene up so far. So 20 minutes and we've nearly actually got a tree that we can actually use. You can see it's really quick and easy. So now we're in the branch, so I'm actually putting some lumps and things like that on, again to give them character. I'm not too concerned where they are at the moment. I mean, I don't know where I'm going to put my leaves or anything like that. In fact, at this point I wasn't even sure how I was going to do the leaves, whether we were going to have, just a kind of rounded lump and stylize that, or we were going to use that rounded lump and use an emitter. In the end we went with an emitter, and you'll see that a bit later on in the building process. So you can see now I'm sharpening them all up. Again with the trim curve, as you can see, I'm cutting parts away, being very careful that I don't cut the whole tree away, of course. And now you can basically see it's pretty much done, so I'm bringing it now into Blender. I can see as well that it's way, in fact I brought that down, I decimated that first before actually bringing it into Blender, just to get that polygon count down. And I'm just pulling the scene out and establishing, okay, we've got the main focal point, which is going to be the tree where everything kind of comes off. And now we just need to plan around the tree and give it a really nice composition where everything's going to go. Now in the grey box that Luke sent me, he did have a rabbit in a pool, and I was thinking, okay, I can put a male rabbit and a female rabbit and give the male rabbit a cigar or something like that, and go down that route. But then I thought, no, let's make it a little bit more homely, which is what we're going to do here. So I took a lot of ideas from his grey box. So the little swimming pool was a really nice idea, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to put some steps going down to it. And here you can see I'm starting on the actual beehive. Now I started on this and I'm thinking, this is going to take a long time. Could I get a better result out of Blender? So what I did was I got the right size of it. I basically brought these out, beveled them off, and then subdivisioned it. And it came out absolutely perfect. I was like, whoa, that's really easy to do. So that's exactly what I did. So I beveled it, I extruded them out, subdivisioned, and then I ended up with this result. And now I'm going in and just obviously roughening it all off because it's way too straight off the bat. So it's a bit tedious, this part, but it only took like 5 minutes at the most just to roughen all that out. You can see I'm just going very carefully, smoothing that off then, because on something like that you just need it. And I'm just attaching it to the branch in a kind of realistic way. So looking at references here, seeing how bees actually attach these things to branches. Normally actually they don't actually look so rounded. We are going for a stylized look, so that's why it looks like that. So here I realized that if we didn't have an outflow on this stream, it would literally just overflow. So we can't have that. So we need something to actually make it overflow. And also it would be really nice if we actually had another waterfall, not just leading into the pool, but actually off of the edge of our scene, so that worked out kind of great. Here you can see I'm actually brought in some blocks, I duplicated them, and then each of these blocks basically I'm going to turn into a stone. So you can see there, clay build up, trim dynamic, that's it, stone's done. These took probably 2 or 3 minutes each. Very, very fast to do. So, and you can see it got a really, really nice result. Again, you can make these rocks in Blender. It will take you a bit longer, I'm sure. But you could do pretty much everything in here in Blender. You've got all of the tools. It's just, for me, it's much quicker in Zbrush to actually do that, because I'm just so used to using the software, to be honest, at this point. So you can see now I'm fitting all those little steps leading down. I knew that the water was going to go above those steps, so when you can see in the wall, we will be able to see those rocks in the bottom as well. So it's worth putting those in there if you're doing water. I knew also I wanted to have some steps leading up the back as well to tell a story, because up there's going to actually be a swing, which I'm going to animate as well and bring that, and you'll see that a bit later on. So I'm just fitting them in. I made a few variations of the actual rocks, as you can see. You can see here I missed the actual hole, so what I had to do is I had to go in, subdivide it again, and then bring down the polygons with Decimate it all over again, but it was relatively quick. Alright, so now I'm doing is I'm decimating everything down, taking it actually into Blender to set my scene up, because I knew the main buildings, so for instance like the door, the swing, the letterbox, things like that, I'm going to build actually out in Blender. It's going to be, you can build them out in ZBrush, but it's much quicker in Blender. So you can see the sculpting part for me is much quicker in ZBrush, the actual building of the models much quicker in Blender, so that's why I'm bouncing between these 2 pieces of software. Normally, if we were using this actually in a game, it would probably need to be a little bit more optimized, which would mean we'd probably go in and retopologize it. So for that, I use Topogon. Again, it's not because the other softwares aren't very good. You can retopologize in ZBrush or Blender, but I just use Topogon because that's the software I prefer, and that's the one that's actually quickest for my actual workflow. Generally, if you're going to get a job in the industry, it's gone are the days where, you know, if you're working in a studio, then you're probably going to have to use something like Maya or Blender or something like that. You will be able to use ZBrush and things like that, of course. Well, gone are the days really when you freelance where you're actually restricted to an actual piece of software. So whatever's quickest for you, because at the end of the day, everything's going to be going out as an OBX or an FBX or something like that. Alright, so now you can see that I actually used the rock generator within Blender just to make some nice rocks, and then I'm going to again take these into ZBrush and I'll just create them into really, really nice looking rocks. But it's a really, really easy way just to get them in. I flattened those ones out because I knew that's where the actual waterfall was going to be. I've also put that door in there, and you can see it doesn't quite fit yet. So what I've done is I've put the door in, and I'm going to actually send that through then to ZBrush and basically pull my tree and my ground around that. So just a couple of quick mushrooms here, as you can see. Again, really, really easy to actually create in Blender. So now I'm looking actually what else I've got. I can see that I've got some some mushrooms. I thought, okay, I'll make a start on those. I do put them on the front in the beginning, but then I quickly move them around the back, and the reason for that is because it's a whole scene, and if you're doing a 360-degree turn, you basically want all parts of it to tell a story. So you can see round the back there's the mushrooms, steps leading up, we've got the beehive, coming back round we've got the actual waterfall, all the way around to the front where then you can see the letterbox and that tranquil post and things like that. So alright, so I'm actually taking what Luke did and basically rebuilding it. The reason I'm rebuilding it is because some of it is a little bit thin for the stylized look that we're going for. It was built, most of this I think, in ZBrush. And for me, I like things a little bit chunky. Also, when I bring a lot of models in from a grey box, you will see that they're really, really crazy on the polygon count, or the topology is really, really bad, so that's why I'm actually going in and recreating them. Now you can see here what I did was I actually brought in a geo nodes that I'd already created from our actual stylized wagon, one of the courses that we did, and then I've basically appended it, brought in that geo node, and then I'm using that actually to turn my curves into actual rope. I've got another tutorial how to turn curves into chain, so it's pretty much a similar thing to that. Geonodes are really, really amazing for anything like this. because you could see there that as I made the curves smaller, the rope actually changed in size. Or you can actually use the object mode and then you can make the curves smaller and the rope will stay the same size. So you've got a lot of actual control over that. And you can see how actually good those ropes look. It was taken from a tutorial from a guy on right here on YouTube. And it's just so handy to have. You can see as well that I decimate, because we're doing stylization as well, those ropes are actually perfect, and all I did then is decimate them down, and they're really good as well if you send them through to Substance Painter. Now what I'm doing in there is I'm cleaning everything up. I'm getting rid of any materials that I don't need. I'm getting rid of any geo nodes that I've got in there that I'm not actually using. Basically that cleanup operation will basically get rid of anything that you're not actually using within your scene. So now the same thing again with the rope. You can see I've also attached it, and that rope actually you could have had chain on there, but I'm thinking out in the middle of the forest, probably going to be more likely some weaved rope or something like that, so that's why I use rope instead. I'm trying to stick to the theme and tell the story all the way through and make it look as homely as possible. Chains have a habit of making something look very cold, you know, in a way. It's hard to fit it in the scene and make it look homely like this. It's such a small scene as well that using a chain, yeah, it probably won't look right actually. So now you can see I'm just pulling that around, making it all fit. And now I'm just testing different things, seeing what else I need. I know I don't need to smooth anything off in here because all it's going to do is just add to the polygon count. So now again we're back in Blender, and now what I'm doing is I'm just beveling everything off, making it look really nice, beveling the door off. Now I'm actually going to start work, I think, on the rocks now. So we're going to start, yep, there we go. So I'm just isolated each of those rocks by splitting them all up, using solo within Zbrush, and then the little tiny rocks I'm just adding subdivisions to them. And what I did actually before splitting all those rocks off, I actually did dynamesh. So I dynameshed all of them at the same time, then I split them off. And what that means is I'm going to get the same consistency all the way through my rocks. So just remember to do that before splitting them off. Again, you can see here it's simply clay build-up, trim dynamic, and probably honestly for this whole scene you're probably using 4 or 5 brushes. It's not a lot of brushes. It's just how you use the brushes. It's not you know, you need a special brush to actually do something. You just get a lot better with the brushes. So you know, if you're looking for really nice clean shapes and things, you can get away with using H polish, S polish, things like that, flatten, trim dynamic, and not a lot else actually. So what I'm doing here is I'm checking to see how far down I need that, because I want it to look right. I don't want it to look as though it's overflowing the scene before actually dropping off the waterfall. So I'm just actually pulling it down, getting an idea in my head, and then going back through to ZBrush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually fix it. Now I always do a lighting check probably 2/3 of the way through, just to see how the scene's actually going to look, how it's coming along. It's just a habit I have. I did it in, I think I've done it in all of the scenes that you've seen me create so far here on YouTube. And it's just some basic lighting, just to see how it's coming on. You can see that I'm putting the mailbox in to where I think it's going to go. In the end, I don't think I was happy with it being there. I'm not actually sure. I think I move it away. And then once I'm happy with everything, I basically turn my lighting off, and then I carry on. And in the end now, we'll come back to lighting to fix that. I did have some problems with this top part of this because Luke created that in ZBrush. Generally shapes like that, you're just going to boolean it out, add some thickness. It's really easy to do. Something that's round with another round circle actually going in Blender, a little bit harder to do. So what I did was I just got fed up trying to fix this. You can see here, trying to fix it. I'm like, you know what, it's just going to be easier to send this through to ZBrush, dynamesh it, and then come in. And you can see dynamic subdivision, adding some thickness, applying that, and there you go. You've got a much easier result that probably took a minute. And sometimes that's why I do that. You can see the topology on it as well isn't that actual bad. And now I can actually carry on and do the top with a simple proportional editing, a few edge loops, and there we go. I think actually on those stones I actually used loose stones because they were very nice, so I just kept them. And a lot of this is just very, very simple. This is the candle, for instance. Just going to put a nice wick on it. And I know that Luke's going to do the lighting on those anyway, so I don't need to put a flame on or anything like that. It'll be done in Unreal Engine. So now what's left is just the 3 incense burning sticks. And I think, apart from the beveling, smooth shading, things like that, we're pretty much done with this actual post here. Let's give it a little bit more character. Make it look a little bit more tranquil. And beveling it off now, and then just setting it in place. And I'm just going around everything, making sure everything's smoothed off and all that sort of stuff. And now we're actually adding in our armature. So this armature is just the same way as we normally do it with anything for chains or rope. We want them all to move together. I have got a tutorial on this. I'll put it up in the top right hand side, so check that out in case I forget. It's under the, it's one with loads of chain on, so you should be able to find it quite easy. Here I actually put it to the wrong part, but now you can see it right, just spinning it around now and making sure it all moves together. And you can see, because now I've set it all up with an IK, just how easy that is to move that along and how realistic, so there you go. So I'm moving it forwards, moving it back. I think I'm using interpolation Bezier on this just to make it move. If you use actually interpolation the Bezier, it gives it weight, so it actually looks as though when it swings back it has some weight there, and then it takes a bit of time before it swings forward, so it's a really, really nice way of doing it. So here I'm thinking this is a weird angle, so I need to really spin this round, so I'm thinking should I attach it then to a cylinder and move it in that way? But I do know actually sending that through to Unreal Engine might cause some problems, so I'm thinking, yeah, I'm probably better off just using a bone, an armature basically, rather than that. And I always remember that if you're using armatures and send it through to Unreal, remember to rename your armature, because there's a bug in Blender where if you send it through, you won't know what's wrong, it won't work, and the reason is because the armature is still named armature, so just make sure you rename those if you send them through for yourself. Okay, so now I'm actually checking the scale of my bee. So we knew we want to have a stylized bee in here. Now what we don't know, and even at this point now when I'm actually recording, is if the bee is going to work or not. So we gave it wings and we thought we could animate it if we need to, just with some noise for instance, but we're going to basically change the bee to a particle. So in other words, the particles are going to be this actual bee. So will it look okay? We're not actually sure at this point, so I'll let you know how we get on with that. I'm sure Luke will, but we might actually need to send it through and actually either animate the wings or delete the wings out of the way. But you can see how easy that bee was to put together. You can see with a simple curve and then a mirror on there, and the bee's looking pretty nice. And the bee I took from The Hobbit when he's in the farm, and you know, there's a big bee who wakes him up. Basically I looked at that bee because, you know, it's kind of a stylized bee and it's made to be much, much bigger than normal. So that's where I took that idea from. So you can see here now, thinking this is a little bit big for that hole, it needs to be a little bit smaller, so I'm just shrinking it down, making sure it can actually go in that hole. And if you look at bees, they only normally make the hole just big enough so they can actually climb through. So I knew if I made it just the right size. Alright, so now we're going through and doing the main part, which is naming everything, so that when Luke gets this and it's been sent through to Substance Painter, everything's named, everything's got the transformation set correctly, and things like that. It's also important because then it enables you to come in and add materials to the different parts, and basically you can split it up in a way where you can create UV maps for the different parts that you want to paint. So you can see here now that I'm splitting it up. I know that something like the tree and the ground, for instance, they need to be on their own UV map because it's such a large part of the scene that you're going to end up with a lot of blurriness if they're not. So that's why I've split them up. You can see now I'm colouring them, and basically what I'm doing is I'm unwrapping them with Blender's Smart UV Unwrap, because I know I'm sending it through to Substance Painter, which means that we will be using triplanar projection, which means that we don't need to worry so much about the seams. Then what I'm doing is I'm basically using average iron scale to make sure all the UVs are the same size in comparison to each other, and then finally what I'm doing is I'm actually packing them in the UV. Now I know that I need some leaves, and this is where I'm thinking, okay, this is how I'm going to do my leaves. First of all, I'm going to create just some simple leaves. We're going to have them pink, and then basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate these around, make them bigger and smaller, and finally then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the colours. And this actually, I think, worked out really nice way of actually doing it. So you can see here, just now planning it out, and this is going to be basically like a complete branch. Now the reason I didn't actually put a branch in there is because I don't know what colour Luke is going to create the actual, the tree bark and things like that. So because it's stylized, we can kind of get away with just having this basic branch with all the leaves on. You can see there now, I'm adding a lot of variations in the colour, making sure it's transparent. And now I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it in, quick setup, or at least I thought it would be a quick setup, making some transparency. And once I've got my transparency, you can see there I'm thinking, why is this not working? And there we go, now I've got it working because I just plugged in the wrong node. Alright, so now I'm giving it some edge loops, pulling it out a little bit, just to give it some roundness. If you're ever doing, planes and things like that, just make sure you give them some round. It's going to make it much better. I use that for the emitter, and now just change the emission to my leaves, and there we go. Bring them out, rotate them round, get rid of that transmission on the cycles. And if you bring that down, as you saw there, it will get rid of all that darkness in between your leaves. So now I'm bringing it all down, and now I'm working on the colour. And I'll also go back and work on the amount and the actual rotation and things like that. Now with this, I wasn't sure whether we wanted glowing pink leaves to really add to the scene. After all, we're kind of going down a oriental theme here. So I wasn't sure whether we wanted to add glow or something like that. You can see I do have a problem there in that it's not quite working. I've not actually got the right setup. You can see I'm working on the glow now, but the setup's still wrong. You can see we can still see through those leaves a little bit. So I'm just trying to get this right now and figuring out which way I actually want to go with this. And it does look really nice, as you can see. It is a really nice effect. I'm just not sure at this point if I want to actually do that. Alright, so now I'm thinking, well, the colour's gone from my leaves and I need to fix that. So I'm just going back in now and trying to fix what the issue is. Trying to curve. And there we go, it's all done. And now what I'm doing is I just put it all together there in the end and changed it from an actual emitter or a particle system into actual mesh, because I know that the mesh actually is going to be, although it's a few thousand polygons, it's actually quite low when you consider how many leaves there are and things like that. If it was just leaves, you could take those into Unreal Engine and it would be hundreds of thousands of polygons and it would work, but in Blender it would be quite hard. Alright everyone, so that brings us to the end of the modeling section of the Stylized Treehouse. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got a lot out of it, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot, bye bye.
To start the texturing process, I went ahead and wanted to get some textures out of the way first, and I really wanted to get a nice kind of a stylized terrain look for those textures. So I went ahead and made some PBR textures out of nice stylized painted materials, and I got myself some really nice results out of a Substance Alchemist. And afterwards I wanted to get some cherry leaves, so I got some basic cherry blossom kind of leaves out of the way and wanted to give a little bit more depth to them. So what I did was I drew some lines. I used liquify just to bend them a little bit towards the shape of a leaf, and I kind of blurred out the entire look, which in turn gave me a nice kind of a depth in the middle of that leaf. I also just did a quick outline for those leaves, and I made sure they kind of overlay with the color just to make sure that the edges are a little bit more darkened up, and in turn it would give us a little bit more depth. And just like I did with the previous texture, I went ahead and went to the Alchemist and simply converted them to PBR textures. However, I wanted to get an additional texture map out of it, and I wanted to make myself a subsurface scattering texture just to get nicer results for whenever a light source is lighting up all those leaves, and it would just give us a much more kind of a control over the way that the light is being bounced off from those leaves. So after I was happy with it, I went ahead and opened up the blender that Neil provided, and I was really happy with the way he did all the modeling. I just wanted to make sure that everything was in order, and all the normals, just in case I wanted to check them, all the normals were properly set up so I could bake off my texture and maps. Things like ambient occlusion, curvature maps, they would go really well, but obviously if we have some flip normals, it would be kind of a mess and would give us definitely some weird results. So right now I'm just testing it out. I'm seeing that I'm getting some artifacts. I think like one of the polygons was flipped on the tree, and I just went ahead and fixed that real quick. And that's usually why you want to start by baking in a lower resolution, just so you wouldn't have to wait and you could see all the results right away. Especially for normal and ambient occlusion, if you just bake only those two, you could easily find where the mistakes are. And in this case, I believe the biggest mistake was it's because the mesh for the tree was from Zbrush, and whenever you're importing with Blender Zbrush, it sometimes gives off some weird results. But again, it was an easy fix. I just re-imported the overall mesh and just rebaked all of the textures back up. And afterwards that, I got some really nice bakes for ambient occlusion, normals, and in turn, because of it, I also got some good curvature maps and whatnot, so I was able to make use out of them, since they're really important for whenever you're doing any of the stylized kind of work, just to bring out the overall shape of each one of those assets from the scene. But anyway, to continue on with the texturing process, I started off by applying a dirt material, and I wanted to just blend in more of those values together. So I think what I did was I used an anchor point just to get curvature detail out of that basic material, and afterwards I just applied it onto the edges just to get kind of a highlight for these bits. Once I was happy with it, I went ahead and continued my texturing process. This time I wanted to get some grass on top of our terrain, and I started off by just applying it on top of our entire terrain and playing around with masks just to get a little bit more of that extra detail for the grass. So I wanted to get some roughness values as well as a little bit more of a kind of a highlight on the edges for the grass as well. So that's what I did. Then I was thinking on how to blend in the overall value, and I think I ended up using a hairbrush from within the substance painter, which gives us a really nice result for the edges of the grass. It almost makes it look like they're going through the side, and overall aesthetically I quite liked the way it turned out. And in order to blend the values with the dirt and the grass, I think I just copied the mask for after I was done painting it for the grass and applied it on the dirt, then just inverted it. This way the masks don't overlay with one another, and the normal values and height values don't actually cause a bunch of unnecessary noise in between those materials. So once I was happy with that, I wanted to continue the texture process with some wood. And I was trying to figure out how I can texture this kind of a door, this type of a hobbit door. I quite liked with the stylized look that I had, since I just happened to have a really nice texture for kind of a swirls of a wood bark, and I just wanted to make use out of that. But in the end, the color, the original color, I didn't quite like it. It didn't stand out as much, so I think I changed it in the future. But right now I'm just playing around with the values. I'm getting all the metal pieces and whatnot. Luckily I had a bunch of smart materials that worked really nice with this scene. So for example, for the metal, that was already set up with curvature masks and ambient occlusion masks, and I just had to apply that. And that's why I was really focused at the very start to create really nice bakes for those curvature and ambient occlusion masks, just to make sure that the rest of the detail for whenever I was texturing came out super nice. So after I was happy with that, I wanted to apply some textures for that lantern in the front. I didn't want it to stand out too much, so I just made it a lowly saturated kind of a color. But obviously, because it's a kind of a light scene, I just wanted to give it much lighter kind of a tone, so I ended up with going with light gray sort of a result. And after I was out with that, I just continued the texturing process, got some textures for the robe, then started off doing some texture for the wax candles as well. If you're interested in seeing how I made those candles, the textures for those candles, by the way, there is a video for that showing a little bit more and in depth of that kind of a process, since I'm only using a saved up material for that. And basically you can check that out in our Stylized Tower environment. It uses cylinder projection just to get those nicer normal results out of it. But yeah, once I was done with that, I wanted to continue off the texturing process and started doing the bark texture, and I wanted to get a really nice bark flow. And because the way this tree is shaped, it was kind of hard to unwrap, so I think we just used an automatic unwrapper using Zbrush, which gives us some nice results. But in turn, what I had to do for this case was I used triplanar projection, and because some of the tree chunks were going horizontally, I made a duplicate out of it, switched around the projection to be going sideways, and then blended these two materials together just so I could make sure that those grains are going the right way. So once I was happy with the way that the material for the bark turned out, I wanted to continue the texturing process for the mushrooms and the ones in the back for the fungus as well. So I'm just mainly playing around with the way the curvature masks are, and I'm just applying some additional dirt. But in the end, I think I lowered that dirt by quite a large amount because we're making a nice and happy sort of a scene, and that wouldn't fit with the way those gritty mushrooms would look like if they would have that much of dirt on top of them. I think I kind of lowered that down in the end and just make sure I highlight the shape overall with some curvature masks. And for the mushrooms, I added some splats, kind of a dots later on, just to make them stand out a little bit and make them look more cartoony as well. So once I was happy with that, for the rope of the swing as well as for the bottom, again I just reused the same materials that I had previously that I used for the post, for example, and I just continued on with texturing the beehive next. And for that I wanted to get a bit of a kind of detail in between the edges. So I think I used a curvature mask, which I then changed it up to cavity mask, and it gave me some nice kind of a mask that we were able to use in between those bumps, and I just highlighted the overall kind of shape and gave more depth with it. I also added a bit of normal map bumps just to kind of make the overall shape look a little bit more roughened up. Because obviously we're working with more organic shapes, you don't want them to be looking just kind of artificial and really smooth. So in keeping with that in mind, don't want to overdo it in those kind of cases because unnecessary noise would just be too much. And after I was happy with that, I went ahead and just played around with the overall aesthetics and how the overall kind of scene looks like. I played around with the values, the coloring and whatnot, just to get the overall kind of a look much nicer. And then I figured that the post box looks a little bit too plain, so I decided to add a number at the front. In Substance Painter, if you were to just simply search for font, you'll be able to find a lot of text that you can just put it in your Paintbrush Alpha, and underneath it you'll find a bunch of text options that you can switch out and just write whatever you want. So it's quite easy to make a custom message on top of it. Right now I'm just finishing up the mushrooms by adding some dots, as I said previously, and just again playing around and getting the right kind of a feeling for this overall scene. So right now for the roots, I figured they were the same color and they didn't quite fit the overall scene since the tree looked too plain. So because usually the roots would look more dull and less saturated if they're just sticking out like that in the air, I just wanted to go ahead and simply do that for the color variation of those roots. And afterwards I went back to the door and switched up the color. I wanted to make it really pop out. Then once I was happy with the overall result, I just went ahead and exported out the textures. Alright, so in order to start off my process for setting up the scene within Unreal Engine 5, I firstly went back onto Blender and made sure I export out the animated FBX files separately from the ones of just static meshes. And I made sure to do that because Unreal Engine automatically picks up those animations and makes sure it imports as a skeleton mesh. But then afterwards, I just went ahead and created myself a new project, made myself a new level, and made sure that whenever I load up a new project, I just open up that level straight away. So afterwards, I just quickly dragged all the assets into the level and just made sure that they're scaled properly with one another and are in the same location. I had some trouble a little bit with some animations being imported actually, and that is because the scaling was just a little bit off from the center of the world, and that just gave a little bit some of the issues, but it was quick fix. We just had to re-import them right away. So afterwards I just imported all the texture maps, made sure that the packed texture maps for ambient occlusion, roughness and metallic had the sRGB ticked off from its detailed tab. And then I went ahead and quickly created a PBR material and created instances out of it. Then linked up all the texture maps to it, and what I did afterwards was just simply replace the references for the default materials for those imported FBX meshes and simply got myself all the textures right away applied onto the static meshes. So now I'm just figuring out how to import everything in properly and have everything set up, making sure that I'm applying and assigning every single texture map properly. So like the street, for example, wouldn't have a completely different texture map. But afterwards, once I was happy with that, I went ahead and started playing around with the leaves. I started off by getting myself in the same way I had for the PBR texture setup. I also made sure that the two-sided material is turned on. And I also made sure that the subsurface scattering texture map is also connected to it, which definitely allows us to get a greater control over how the lighting shines off those leaves. So I think it definitely helps up with building up that kind of a stylized tone to those types of foliage. So after I was happy with that, I just went ahead and quickly replaced the materials for the foliage instance. And then right away, I wanted to play around with the lighting and see how it affects that the overall leaves. So what I did was I just simply turned off all the stuff in the background just to get a black background. I made sure that the skylight is set up with a skybox so it wouldn't just have real-time indirect lighting, since we didn't have anything in the background and I just wanted to get some nice reflection out of it. So that's what I did, and just basically checked out how the leaves look like. And afterwards I wanted to right away add some motion to it, so I used a simple grass node, which if you were to combine with mesh, you just get some wobbly effect, which is exactly what we want in this case. It just has to be like a kind of a random noise, and just a little bit of a wobble is going to be just fine. So afterwards, after that, I went ahead and continued off the project, and this time I got myself a kind of a candle flicker. It's quite easy and simple to do. All you gotta do is just wobble around the texture in the material using a panner and a sine node, and you just connect them all together, and they're just going to be going back and forth, and you divide them by quite a large amount just to make sure that they don't go off from the texture plane itself. So afterwards, after that, I just added a light flicker and continued off with the project to get myself some bees for the beehive. So what I did was I used particles and attached the mesh to the particles, which also had a point force that the bees would be kind of gravitating towards. I didn't want the bees to be going towards just clumping up in a single point. So what I did was got myself a second point force that would be affecting the bees with a smaller radius, and that would have a negative effect. So whenever they would get too close to the center, they would be pushed off from that point. And just to randomize the movement, I added a noise effect to them, so they would just kind of randomly be flying around the area. And I wanted to make sure that they kind of have a movement within them, so I just made sure that the mesh itself would be aligning to the velocity of where the particle is going, so that way the bees would be always facing whatever they are going, and they would just naturally rotate around. So again, I'm just playing around with the forces right now, trying to get that more of a natural look and trying to figure out how to make them stop wobbling, because at the end of the day, when they're actually finding that kind of equilibrium between 2 point forces, they end up just kind of getting stuck to it and just wobbling around. So I'm trying to avoid that and trying to figure out how to get a kind of a more organic result. So by just simply playing around with these values, I'd be able to get a much clearer understanding of how they're behaving. And it's mainly about like fine-tuning those particles, to be honest. They're not as complicated, but you just want to get a finer tune between the values that you're working with. And I'm now realizing that the motion for the bees is it doesn't look quite as well. They look too static. So I'm thinking, what if I'd add a little bit more motion to them and just get more control over them? So what I did was I tried making use out of a level sequencer, and I attached the entire particle system, which also includes the point force that the bees are attracted towards, and I just basically rotated it around a single pivot point. So this in turn gave some motion that the bees would be following around, and that way we're actually avoiding kind of a way where the bees are getting stuck in between those 2 point forces. I was experimenting a little bit with the particle system, just going back and forth, but I didn't like the way the bees were behaving. So in the end, I just ended up rotating it around a certain axis, and it would just kind of spin around in a way. So it turned out quite well, I reckon. So I liked that. And afterwards, I wanted to add even more motion, and I figured, what if I have some like wobble for the bee wings? So in order to get that wobble, I just made a simple motion on the material. I had to make sure I use vertex paint for this one. I had to determine where the wings are, since I wanted to keep the same kind of material for the bee and not just replace the material for the wings. So I just painted over the wings and used the sine node to just connect it with time, and it gave me that kind of a wobble. I made sure that it's a slight kind of vibration instead of a full out swing. And in the end, it turned out quite nicely, so I was quite happy with the result. And then I just had to replace the mesh for those bees, and now whenever they were moving in a particle, because of the material, they just had that kind of a wobble for those wings, which definitely made it look much nicer. So again, I'm just playing around with the values, making sure that I'm fine-tuning it all, and that the bees overall look really kind of organic and nice. But at the same time, obviously, because we're going for a stylized sort of a look, we can exaggerate some of the motion, but just not by too much, because the stretching out of the wings for the mesh would look really kind of unnatural, and therefore it would just kind of look like it doesn't belong within the scene. So just made sure I don't overdo that. So once I was happy with the way the bees turned out, I went ahead and continued my process, and this time I wanted to add some water for the pool to this off the side of the scene. And right away, I wanted to get some shore kind of foam, just that is bouncing around, just to get a bit of that motion. So I'm just making sure that the mask is looking pretty nice. Looking back at the very start, it wasn't giving us nice detail, but I was just playing around. I was trying to figure out how to get those kind of ripple effects, and at the start I wanted to get the ripple effects to be going inwards towards the depth of the water. But in the end, because we'll be having a waterfall, I ended up getting that foam to be going outwards towards the shore. So that way we get some motion that the waterfall is bringing up, and it definitely made it much better in the future. Right now I'm playing around with the shape. I'm not liking the way the shape is. It's too pixelated for the way the mask is being generated, and I'm trying to figure out how I can fix that up. I think I turned off distance field lighting for the entire scene, for the rocks and whatnot, and I just created invisible primitives around it just to test out a new kind of a shape, because the foam is using distance field edge to generate a mask around different edges of like different static meshes. You're able to get this kind of a foam, but I was trying to figure out how to get that working, and in the end, I didn't like the shape, so my workaround was a little bit different. We'll get back to that in a second though. Right now I'm trying to get more motion for the water just to try to make it more liquid-like. And so I just added normals and just kind of panned them around in between and just got some random kind of a noise of a water motion. So once I was happy with that, I played around a little bit with the waterfall. I got myself an alpha or kind of a ripple effect, and just I overlaid a couple of dots around, made sure that the overall texture is a seamless one, and that was quite an easy way to do within Photoshop. All you gotta do is go onto the filters tab, click over, go offset, and just offset your texture and just fill in the gaps in between. So I did just that. So once I was happy with the quick kind of ripples, I went ahead and created a material for it. I added it to an unlit kind of a shader and just quickly attached it to a plane. That way I'll be able to see what I'm doing, and I just added a panner that was going one way and just simply played around with those kind of values. So I was getting a kind of a nice ripple effect for the waterfall just to get that motion. I was also trying to figure out how I can get the edges to be fading out a little bit more so I could have more control over the shape, the entire shape of an asset. But what I did was I tried playing around with the vertex painting and just made sure that whenever I was painting the vertices on edges, I would just turn off the opacity for them. So I was doing exactly that, just kind of playing around with the values, trying to figure out what exactly kind of a waterfall I want, and just getting myself a nicer kind of result. But again, just tweaking around the values. I didn't like the way this waterfall turned out though, so I ended up switching that, which is totally okay to do every once in a while. You just have to make sure that everything fits within the scene. So I just played around with the values. For now, I got some materials and its parameters set up for the material instance. That would just gave me a kind of a easy way to adjust the values in real time. And again, I played around with the shape with the invisible kind of primitives just to make sure I get the kind of a better shape for the shore. But I wasn't getting any nicer results. I was trying to figure out how to fix up the density for the edges of that foam, and I know you can do that in the project settings. If you go to the project settings, you can edit the density of the field lighting, but for some reason it just wasn't working quite as well for me. I just ended up using a quick workaround. I just ended up upscaling the entire scene actually to a larger kind of portions and just getting a much nicer result for the foam with like a high kind of a detail. So it's a cheap workaround, but it worked out in the end, and I didn't really care about the scale for this particular scene, so I just ended up using that. So now I'm just trying to figure out again what kind of motion I want in the background, and right now I'm trying to figure out the clouds. Maybe I'll add some clouds and get some motion, like a random noise going over them, just to add them, to get them to be a little bit more depth, just to get them to be with a little bit more depth. And I'm just creating quick particle system for those clouds, trying to figure out how I'm going to fit it within the scene, and just want them to have a random motion around the area, just to kind of pan around and slightly move in a random direction. But in the end, I realized that it's a little bit too much for the scene. The clouds ended up looking more like a kind of a fog or whatnot, and all in all, it just didn't quite fit the scene, since the entire area looked quite a simplified stylized scene, and those clouds were definitely just too noisy for that. So I ended up getting a different kind of textures for them and just replacing it entirely, just to get a kind of a softer touch to the background. Right now I'm still trying to play around with them, trying to figure out how maybe I'll be able to get them right, though it didn't work out. Even though I tried to increase like emissiveness, make sure it's unlit so it doesn't get affected by the color, it just didn't look quite as well for the texture. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to fit in the waterfall and just make sure I break apart the waterfall from the water area, and make sure I break apart the waterfall with the fog area, making sure that the fog itself is set up with a higher particle priority. And you can just do that within a details tab. If you just search for priority, you'll be able to get it. The higher number would make it overlap on top of the other particles, but this way they're always going to be in the front of the render and not in the back, which would end up looking kind of weird, especially for the waterfall areas. So just make sure that they're covering up the bits in between, especially for the waterfall that's going downwards. And in the end, I'm now playing around with the cameras, making sure that the cameras, I understand where the overall shots are going to be aligning up with and how they're going to be positioned, just so I could get a better understanding on how the background is going to look, as well as the kind of a waterfall that I didn't quite like just now. So now I'm just figuring out all the kind of close-up shots I'm going to do, just setting up the entire level sequencer basically. And I'm using object spheres that are going to be acting as pivot points, which are going to be invisible in game view. So whenever I'm rendering out this entire shot, it's just not going to be visible like with the rest of the cameras. But now I realized that I wanted to get a different type of a waterfall. I was running out of time, so I found myself online a really nice particle, which was made by Ashif Ali on ArtStation. So I just got myself that. It had a combination of just a nice waterfall and splashes at the bottom. So I just made sure I kind of scale it down a little bit just to fit my scene. Scaling was a little bit too big for what I liked. I just made sure I did that. And once I was happy with that, it gave a really kind of a nice cartoonish motion for the water, exactly the type of one that I wanted. I was really happy with the way it turned out. So now I'm just playing around with the overall shape, the values of that particle. And once I was happy with that, I went ahead and quickly replaced all the texture maps for those clouds. And instead of just using a particle system, I ended up just aligning the planes of those clouds to the camera to be always facing the camera. This way they wouldn't lose all the depth whenever the camera was rotating. Otherwise, because the clouds were kind of close, the planes would be, even for a little bit, if they were to be facing sideways, you'd notice that they're kind of flat, and we obviously don't want that to happen. So by always making sure that they're facing forwards, you don't really get the kind of a sense of depth. And because they already have for the texture, within the texture itself, they already have kind of a depth of the light hitting from the top. It already gives an illusion that they're kind of soft and fluffy. So I was going for that kind of thinking. And once I was happy with the result and the way they turned out, I just positioned the clouds just a little bit more, just so I could get nicer kind of angles for the camera, and just so I could break up the entire environment a little bit in that background. And this way it would also help me out to get the entire scene kind of pop out a little bit more. Then afterwards, I just went out and played around a little bit with the post-process effects, made sure that lighting is set up properly, and once I was happy with it, I was pretty much finished. And that's going to be it, guys. To create the gray box, just to get an idea out, I've used Zbrush, which with the help of Sculptor's tool functionality allowed me to automatically dynamesh areas where I sculpt, so I didn't have to worry about topology, and I was able to really focus on getting the shape of the scene out of the way. So with the basic sculpting, I was able to get all the organic shapes out of the way, and tweaking all the assets and how they combine with one another, I was able to get some real nice results. And I'd give this part a solid 2 out of 10, as it was relatively easy to make, and getting a nice shape for the scene was quite simple to do, and we were working with large assets on a small environment, which makes it super simple to break up some of those simpler edges and in general get a real nice outcome from it. For the modeling part, it was quite difficult on this one, even though it was a quite simple scene. This was due to the fact that it takes practice to make organic shapes like trees and environments. The more you do, the better you become, as your eyes get trained to look at things in your environments in a different way. So this environment would be more suited to the people who already have some modeling experience under their belt and want to try to focus on sculpting. The trees are very forgiving, unlike say human anatomy that needs to be very accurate to get some nice results. But the rest of the build was certainly for beginners, as well as a simple animation for the swing and a mailbox. All in all, I would give this modeling section a solid 6 out of 10. In the texturing part, there were a lot of materials used. Some of them I had to create from scratch, and since it is a stylized scene, one needs to put in an extra effort in order to create every asset individually. But all in all, I was able to make use out of generated texture masks to help me out and get some really nice results. The hardest part was probably getting the flow of the bark just right using the texture projection, since I had to mask out parts based on the texture flow. But all in all, I was really happy with the results, and I'm giving this an 8 out of 10 in terms of texturing difficulty. In order to set up the environment within Unreal Engine 5, the process itself wasn't too hard, as most of the items were already set up without much of an effort, other than the ones with animation, that is. We had that fixed in the end though, so all is well. The difficulty came from particle systems though, and the bees flying around, the water system. They all took way longer than I would have wished, but in the end it ended up looking quite nice for the scene, and I really enjoyed the overall process. Because of it though, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 in terms of difficulty, as it was quite hard to set that up. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video for the Stylized Tranquil cherry tree scene environment tutorial. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like us to do next. Also, check out the links in the description down below to see the massive library of courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up for the Patreon. We also have some free goods that are on Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download. So that's going to be it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.